Good evening, Dr. Richards.
Good evening, Dr. Leib. Evening or afternoon? What does this count as?
That's a
This is a
good question.
weird in
I
between.
always get cut in between saying that. I'm gonna say evening,
All
even
right.
though does evening mean like it has to be dark out because we'd be waiting a long time for that.
Yeah, we got another 3 hours for that.
And
4 hours at this point.
theoretically, it's afternoon, obviously, because it's after noontime. But
Yeah.
let's say evening.
Yeah.
All right. So today we're going to continue our discussion on grip strength. Last time we talked about carrying and hanging, bar hanging in general. Today we'll move on to talking about like deadlifting things where you're lifting off the ground. So functionally, just any version of lifting something off the ground, you have to be able to grip it first.
Yep.
And we want to talk about how important the grip is when we think about those tasks, because oftentimes what we cue is people's hips, their spinal angles and things like that, but we don't often think about the grip until we really start having to move heavy things, and we appreciate how important that is.
Yeah.
So we'll touch on that, and then different versions of that. We sort of alluded to this last week, but ballistic type of power movements such as kettlebell swings, cleans, barbell cleans, like there's a grip that's involved with them that certainly is necessary, and you have to have a grip, but it can't be as firm of a grip as we would think of with heavy strength stuff. So discussing the differences there and some of the techniques that are used to allow for this power and strength in the grip, but also a looseness, for lack of a better term, that allows you to still move fast. So I think that'll be an interesting conversation. So we'll start with you're in a population where you're doing probably some heavy lifting with your athletes. You've certainly done your share of heavy lifting, being a lacrosse player and an athlete in your career. How do you view grip strength in terms of deadlifts and sort of those strength movements where you have to pick things up from the ground?
I think it's a pretty important foundation if you're having someone come in and I think assessment wise, if someone comes in and you kind of can tease out okay, if actually lower body strength, they can lift this weight on a deadlift, but they're limited by grip. That's kind of a big discrepancy there.
Right.
So I think it really matters. And I actually think it also matters from execution of the lift and efficiency in terms of being able to create that tension through the hands that irradiates up through the upper body and into the core is actually just going to help create tension throughout the body as well. And especially with a deadlift, you want to be able to create stiffness to move in the places you want to move, and actually be mobile in the places you want to be mobile. And weirdly enough, this has actually come up a couple times this week. We have some new barbells at the gym that the knurling is not very grippy yet. And so people have actually been struggling a little bit with grip. So I've been kind of having some conversations about this, but obviously kind of texture of the knurling plays a role, but it's just funny. We're talking about this now. And it's something I haven't, it's something that I think about a lot, as I'm sure you think about a lot, but I haven't had a ton of conversations with people surrounding grip recently. Potentially because of population differences or whatever it is. I think for the most part, in terms of deadlifting, we're having people that are able to maintain their grip when they're doing their deadlifts, but that's not to say it could be optimized more, but it's just come up a lot this week with some new bars in the mix, and people are actually struggling to get a hold of things, quite literally. So yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, I guess that's kind of how I look at it. If there's a really big discrepancy, then it's probably something that needs to be addressed. And especially with max lifts, it's something you can cue to potentially create more strength and tension throughout the body. But how do you use it with your clients? How do you kind of think about it in terms of deadlifting or even more ballistic movements too?
Well, I think it's interesting how you're talking about it. It can become a limiting factor. And also, if you do see a big discrepancy, I think there's two ways you can approach it. One is you can say all right, I'm not going to allow you to move this weight, even if you feel like you're stronger elsewhere in your body. If your hips are strong enough, I'm not going to allow you to move a heavier weight until your grip matches, your ability to move that weight. Or we could say, okay, let's separate that out and do some things where we actually assist the grip and put a little bit more load in the hips and the legs. And I think it's good to do both. What I find a lot of times with my clients is the grip is such a limiting factor just because of the sensitivity of the hand to touch metal, and touch metal when it gets to be a heavier object, it sort of is alarming to the hand. So there's this, when you're thinking about grip strength and grip progression, you also have to think about grip tolerance, right? Just the tolerance to the sensitivity of, you know, something touching your hand that you're not used to. Now that's less of an issue typically in an athletic population, but it can be still. I mean, I know when I got into CrossFit, there was all this sensitivity that I had to get used to with dealing with barbells. Less so with just like the firm grip of lifting something from the ground, but certainly with any type of ballistic movements like snatches, cleans, where it was landing in my palms, on my wrists in ways that I wasn't used to. And so that sensitivity is, to me, like step one to get people used to, and you don't want to force that too quickly, but you don't want to have people run away from that either. And I think that happens way too often in fitness, is that we underestimate the grip because it hurts. You know, there's just this sensitivity, like this can't be right because my hand is too sensitive to be able to tolerate the metal now. But you're really not going to be able to get past if you can't get past that, it's really going to be hard to get stronger in a way that actually carries over to function, in my opinion. And this is where it's like, okay, if you get too comfortable with just using machines, where you can kind of take the grip and that discomfort of having to feel some steel in your hands, if you take that out of it too often, then you're going to be really sensitive when you have to pick up an awkward object. And it's just really interesting to feel like how grip doesn't just get better. It's like you can squeeze something harder. It gets better too, where it's like I can open my hands more and I can feel a firm, solid object on my hand, and it doesn't feel as uncomfortable, and I can hold that longer. So I think, you know, that what I see is that there's this sensitivity that you have to get through, that you don't want to just say, well, I can lift more than this, but my hands are getting in the way. We'll say, let them get in the way. Let's build that up too with the rest of your movement. But then just to kind of keep people appeased, you can also do some stuff that it's just like, all right, let's just work the hips without as much of a need for the grip. I think it's important to be coming at both angles there.
Yeah. And I think it depends on what that person is coming to see you for too, where it's like, if you're having someone come in for general fitness or general, you know, progressive and sustainable training versus like coming in very specifically for, say, like a hamstring injury or something, and your goal is to actually really target hamstrings in a specific manner, then it's like, okay, you might be more, or at least maybe you do one set with just gripping normally, and then maybe you give them straps or something so that you can fatigue the target muscle group to the right amount. But it's so true what you're saying about like actual sensitivity to grip, especially you mentioned CrossFit, like the amount of people you see in CrossFit that actually end up tearing their hands open at some point, just because it's like they're actually exceeding their capacity to handle grip in a very specific way. And, you know, that can be applied to exceeding capacity in, you know, any type of injury, but like with hands, it's quite easy to see.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's just interesting, like how much time and how, you know, many reps it might take to actually be able to adequately callus the hands and desensitize them so that you're able to handle the loads you want to hold. But I liked what you were saying about how that applies to actual function in real life with handling odd objects.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good segue into the idea of like the ballistic swinging movements. I know like in Strong First world, you know, there's a lot of kettlebell swings, a lot of kettlebell snatches, and especially when you're preparing for those certifications, we have to do a 5-minute snatch test where you got to get 105 minutes, and that whole weekend you're doing just, you know, hundreds and hundreds of swings. So the hand care is a huge part of that weekend. But it's also like there's a mentality that comes to that. Like I think there's a switch that happens where it's like, I'm deciding to train like this. Like you're going to accept that sometimes you might blister in your hands, and being able to be okay with that, I think is actually a big step. Like you don't want your hand to blister ever, but giving yourself the possibility that it happens and saying like, yeah, I've been here before, it's no big deal. I'd rather do it differently next time, where I let it callus, you know, stop before I blister. But that is an important I think, stepping stone to more strength is getting your hands just, you can think of it as you're getting your hands calloused to more work, but also experiencing or like being okay with that idea that my hands are going to blister. You know, sometimes I think people get a little too prideful. They'll take pictures of their blisters like it shouldn't be a trophy, but like to be in that world where it's like, yeah, that like I'm used to that. The people I hang out with are used to that. That's an important part of getting stronger. And it tends to happen with a lot of high volume work, like high rep work, where there's grip more than, you don't see it quite as much with just heavy lifts. Where with heavy lifting, I've noticed that like with my deadlift, just adding a little bit of chalk, what a mental game changer that can be, right? Like if the bar feels sticky in my palm compared to slipping even a little bit, like when I'm getting closer to my max reps, I mean, it's such a difference. I just feel so locked in. You use the term irradiation or irradiate. So this idea of like the grip to me is the absolute charger to irradiating tension throughout your body. And that's a neurological term for just there's an overflow of muscle tension from one area to another throughout the body. So as you get your grip stronger and as you get your grip more anchored, it's such a charge for your whole body to work as a unit. And you experience that. I've experienced that when you get really heavy with lifting, feeling the difference in your grip, like, oh, I didn't grip that right. Like you're going to feel so much weaker on that rep. It's just going to, if you get it, you're going to feel like it was ugly. If you have a nice anchor in your grip, you're going to feel like that was clean. And even if it feels heavy and you're exerting force, you're going to feel like it was clean. So to me, that the grip is this starting point. It's the starting point for creating tension throughout your body, but you have to get that right, or you're not going to feel very strong.
I think that applies, like we've been talking a lot about deadlifting, but also applies to even like a squat where
Absolutely.
grip isn't necessarily the actual thing. I mean, keeping the bar up quite as much, but it's still another way to create tension throughout the body and just help you feel, like you said, just so locked in. You talked a little bit about the more ballistic movements with kettlebell swings and things like that, and kind of being okay with that blistering potentially happening. Do you think, like, part of the reason obviously is just from increased volume, but do you think another reason of that happening is due to like the actual ability to loosen your grip and then retighten it? Like, do you think that creates more tension at the actual skin level? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be more friction because you actually have to move the object in your hand. So the same thing happens with kipping style pull-ups in CrossFit, because there's sort of this in between where it's like I want to grip it actually very loose so I can flow with it, but I have to make sure I'm gripping it tight enough that I don't fall off the bar. And it's the same thing when you're swinging a kettlebell. Is like I want to really hold it as loose as I can without losing it. But as the bell gets heavier, you have to grip it tighter, right?
Yeah.
So then it becomes this combination of how heavy is the bell, how much volume you're doing, and then there's the other element of adrenaline. When you're starting to do workouts like that you're actually pushing out a lot of reps. There's so much circulation going through your body. There's so much adrenaline through your body. You actually are going to have a delayed response to feeling that you're actually blistering. And I've had this happen several times where it's like I have no sensation that I'm doing anything negative to my hands until I'm done, and I'm like, oh shit, my hand is open, right? And like it happens more when you're actually like trying to push for more speed, more like some type of competition. So you just, I think, have to be aware of that, and that's where I think good programming comes in. If you're trying to prevent blistering, you have to almost spare yourself from that, at least for most of the time in training. And then like let that unleash in a competitive mode or competition, and then be okay with like blistering a little bit if you're in competition, because like hopefully you built up for that moment. But you don't want to be blistering all the time in training, because then it'll actually limit your ability to train. So purposely having like reps and sets that aren't near your max, and even if you're pushing for high speed, that you're keeping your reps kind of low, that's a way to prevent that. That'll also help you practice the most appropriate grip for the movement, for the weight that you're doing.
You refer to that like kind of gripping things just enough. You refer to that as reactive grip. Is that what you call it?
Yeah, I mean that's what the terminology kind of comes naturally to me, because I think of it
Yeah.
as I have to react to the movement of the bell. And even if I'm again doing something like a kipping pullet, I want to almost come off the bar and then re-catch. So it's
Yeah.
sort of like a catch and release idea, where my grip is just reacting to the speed of the bell. Like I don't want to pre-tension my grip necessarily, which I will with a heavy 1 rep max deadlift or back squat. Right? It's like I want my grip to be anchored in before I do anything hard. Right? Like I'm pre-emptying the tension that once the bar starts to, I feel the load of the bar. Now I have to hope that like it can create enough pre-tension to match the load of the bar. I don't want to have to add that tension once the exercise gets hard. Where with the swinging type movements, I'm going to sort of stay as loose as I can, reacting to the bell, because it's a more dynamic motion. I'm going to go down with it. I'm going to go up with it. I don't want to be trying to stop the flow of the bell. So I don't want my grip to over tense, or that will stop the flow. I have to really match just what I need to hold on to that bell. And it'll change at different trajectories of the motion, right? Like if I'm doing a kettlebell swing, as it goes through my legs, my grip might have to change subtly because it's a different cast, right? Like if it's between my legs, I'm going to have to change my grip so I don't throw it between my legs. And if I'm at the top of the motion, I'm going to have to change my grip a little bit so I don't throw it forward. So I have to react to where the bell is at every part of the movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I just think I guess this isn't a question. I was thinking about that too in the context of actual like endurance for grip too, where it's like you mentioned that 100 rep snatch test from Strong First. If you try to grip that thing hard off the bat, you're screwed, because it's like your forearms are just going to be cooked, 40 reps into the test, and then you're out of luck, I guess.
Yeah, and you can think like anytime you're trying to move fast and for endurance, unless like that you're doing some specific activity where you're trying to isolate the upper body, you're going to be better served not using your upper body as much and using your hips and just sort of momentum more. Like so the more you are gripping tight, that is going to create more tension and strength needed in the upper body. And oftentimes for endurance and speed, that's not going to be useful, right? Like you're going to always be able to create more power, speed and endurance from your lower body. I think that even just the physiology of it is that we have like more type 1 fibers in our lower body. So our lower body is going to get gassed a lot later than our upper body. So it's just a good strategy to not overtax your grip when you're trying to move for endurance or move for speed or power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I mean, your strategy also might change throughout the sequence of the test, where it's like as things start to fatigue, if legs start to fatigue, you start kind of actually using a little bit more upper body, and then just having that variability is almost like that grip layering we talked about last week, but just extrapolated to the full body of having that variability to be able to change strategies as you go under fatigue, just makes you that much fitter or that much more resilient at a certain feat of fitness, whatever it is.
100%. Yeah. And it's interesting. Like we talked about the grip layering more from like a tighter squeeze last time, like when we were doing a carry. But the same thing happens when you're even trying to be a little bit looser with the grip. Is the hook of my wrist, how well does the bell fit into like the hook of my wrist towards the palm or lower down into the wrist? And that actually is its own kind of grip that I can build some endurance and strength with. And then the hook where it's like between my hand and the beginning of my fingers, like my MP joints, or then even like hooking it further down, like right on the edge of the fingers, getting strength through all of those areas, but in more of like a hook style as opposed to a crush style, becomes, I think, very useful when we're trying to do longer duration things where the grip is involved. And the barbell grip that's very commonly discussed, and this is even just with like heavier 1 rep max things with Olympic lifting, is a hook grip where you sort of tuck your thumbs under so you don't have that crush grip on the bar, but you're still able to get a good portion of your palm on there. And to me, I think the idea of that, one is it sort of biases the shoulders a little bit towards an internally rotated position so that when you come up, it can kind of keep the bar a little closer to the body. But it allows for, I think, the optimal amount of grip and hook on the bar without actually over squeezing it, so that you can still have the power to move that bar up there. And because if you try to over use your arms, which I do all the time when I get heavy with a barbell Olympic lifting, you feel like you just can't get it up as high. You lose velocity, and if you lose velocity, then you're not going to be able to lift heavier weights. So that grip is what's commonly taught. It feels very awkward at first if you're used to sort of like a deadlift grip, but I think that's the purpose of it.
It's another form of desensitization right there. Like I remember when I first started doing hook grip, my thumbs were just killing me.
Yeah, you blister
And
on the inside of the thumbs usually.
Yeah, and even just like the pressure from it,
right.
it just felt different from anything I'd ever done. I'd have to like tape my fingers up, things like that. But yeah, I haven't used that in a while. So now that we're talking about it, I should probably get back to working a little bit of that in.
I think it's interesting to know the why when you do a new task too, because I went through the same thing. And what it feels like, if somebody tells you to use that grip and you feel like you're very sensitive to that grip because it's new, you're going to feel very weak there. And that's just because you weren't necessarily doing it well in the first place. Like if you've never used that grip, which is optimal for Olympic lifters, if the best in the world tend to use that, then it's probably something you should do. But there'll be this natural resistance. Oh, I don't feel as strong there. Well, that's because you're not doing it well, right? But you have to understand the why for all of this stuff, so that you could stay in the game, and then just appreciate, okay, my training right now might be I have to go a little bit lighter so I can get used to this new grip. But in the long run, it's going to become something that I will desensitize to, I will feel a lot stronger with, and the whole movement will be better. So that's, I think that's part of this discussion is, even when it's full body endeavors, and even when you're not trying to use your grip to a max level, the grip is still really important, right? Like to build up different grips, like to be able to shape your hand in different ways. I think that's what makes us kind of uniquely human, right? Like we have opposable thumbs, we can do fine motor skills, but even within the strength world, it's important that we're able to change our hand position and still be strong, but it's very specific. We have to train every grip very specifically.
Yeah. How are you using anything specific to assess that kind of grip endurance or strength in terms of like kettlebells, barbells? I know last week we obviously talked a lot about carries and things like that. Is there anything you're doing in terms of like deadlifts or in terms of swings or ballistic movements where you're kind of assessing that?
I'm not specifically assessing grip, but I think this is why I did a whole chapter on grip strength, and I wanted to take that concept that's in the research of using hand dynamometers for grip and say, okay, that's important, but should we as healthcare professionals or movement professionals be just having people squeeze things in isolation to build their grip strength, because it seems that if grip strength gets better, they're going to live longer? Or should we try to find a more practical way to look at how we're using grip anyway, right? And just make sure that our programs incorporate a lot of things that also include grip. And I think that's more of how I approach it, whereas like I want people to eventually be able to do a kettlebell swing if they've never done it before, because there's different grip challenges to that are more reactive. I want some version of that. If it's not a kettlebell swing, then maybe it's some type of even medicine ball work where there's a catching element. You know what I mean? Like getting people to do a catching element is that reactive grip in a different way, but trying to incorporate as much of that as a broad category as possible, and then just fitting the exercise in for what works for the person, and then having just strength stuff where you have to pick up heavier stuff from the ground. So I'm always including that with everybody, but it's just again, people are going to be limited from a lot of different places. Maybe it doesn't feel that grip taxing because their back is sensitive, or they're just fearful of the movement, so I can only give them a 10-pound weight, but they're in the process, right? So that's this idea of the movement continuum, where we're going to be working those movements, and as they get better, more confident, all these things have to change and to move forward. Grip is going to be involved in that. If there's just a huge limitation though in fear, or some other area of the body is getting in the way of being able to go heavier, then carries tend to work well. Like supported hangs tend to work well for grip. And I don't often do it as like a specific assessment. I don't know that that's necessary, but
Yeah.
I have the exercise in a program that I'm seeing progress. So that in itself is the assessment.
Yep. Yep. I mean, yeah, in reality, I guess every exercise is an assessment. I
Right.
feel like I tell people that all the
Yeah.
time. Like, we're gonna try some stuff. It's an exercise, but we're also just seeing how you do with this.
But I would say, like, to back that follow that up, is in any program that I'm doing, if I were to have to like break things down to the common denominator, I would say if say I can't get somebody to bend their elbow because their elbow hurts, I can't get somebody to move their shoulder because their shoulder hurts. My common denominator of any type of upper body strength is just as long as I'm somehow able to tax the grip, I'm happy and I'm satisfied that I'm doing something good for that person. Right. And then I'd like them to be able to move their joints more and things like that. Right. Like we're always trying to get people to do more. But if we think of just challenging the grip in multiple ways as the fundamental of upper body strength, I've found so many times where, like, especially when people come in with some type of neck issue or postural issue, shoulder issue, something that's more upper body, that they've had a chronic issue there and they're very sensitive to movement, just like really doubling down on making them feel their legs, and it is so valuable, right? Like it just gets them feeling like, okay, I'm really exercising here, and it actually becomes almost pain relieving for the upper body because it's just moving pressure down, right? So instead of thinking of it, like, because everybody, when they have something going on, the area that hurts, I think they got to strengthen or stretch that area specifically. It's like, let's leave that alone, and let's just, from a fitness standpoint, really work below that, and then just do the bare minimum for the upper body. Just like, can you hold something with your hand? Can you just hold a weight? And so a lot of times a farmer carry feels good. It pulls the shoulders down. But then that to me is like, okay, we're still doing some upper body strengthening, and we're in a process of building that if you're comfortable with that. But you don't actually have to move the joints. It's way less threatening. And then we're doubling down on what we're doing with the lower body. And that actually becomes a nice little process for fitness and rehab at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the beauty about being able to be in this space of kind of an in between or span both sides of the rehab to
100%.
fitness continuum, which I think was that our first episode. It might have been.
Yeah. And it's funny, it's like almost 20 years in now, and just like realizing how simple that concept is, it's just like kind of dawning on me more now, because when you're in a clinic, you always have to treat the area, right? You can't even think outside of that box to say like, okay, I don't even want to touch that area, but we can do so much more because you have a whole body that isn't hurting, right? Like we don't have to just focus on doing manual therapy, doing stretching, doing stuff directly on that area, but that's what an insurance company would need to see. But when you take yourself out of that, you realize like it actually makes very little sense. So you're much safer doing 80 to 90% of the work not on that area, but not having to limit it. Like you don't have to baby people because they're in pain if you're not working anywhere near the area that they feel is unsafe. So once you start like getting out of that model where you have to like do stuff to the thing that they're complaining about, you actually can do a lot more. And it can, there's not as many of those sessions where people are coming in and they're hurting, and it's sort of like you're taking a step back because you can't do anything that day. It's like, yeah, we don't have to worry about that. Like if it hurts while we're doing it, let me know, but it's probably not gonna, because we're going to be working so distant from the area.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always just like you said initially, with hitting the lower body pretty hard in the case of someone with an upper body injury, and then just gain some grip in. It's like it allows you to, maybe you can do a couple things in that area. And then it's like, you can just get after it otherwise and continue to improve overall health of the body.
Right. Yeah. And I think we also have this mentality of like, we got to strengthen something or we got to stretch it. Like there's this either or, and certainly like the general population of people that aren't in the industry will have more of that binary idea. So giving just a different model, a different sense of how do you actually use your upper body when you're functioning? How often do you do a bicep curl, like when you're doing anything throughout the course of the day? How often, like if you were to pick something up from the ground, would you want to have it be this inefficient where you were just using your arms, like, and neglecting your legs? No, right? Like, so if that's hurting and you don't feel comfortable doing that, like, can't we still get a ton in by not having to do that and just having you maybe hold objects while you're using more of your lower body? And I do think like that becomes so valuable, like, because you see that's if you're using your upper body too much, oftentimes you're being inefficient in daily life. So like having people have to not use that as much and then teach them how to use down lower, I think actually becomes a nice teaching process.
Yeah, it's another form of like load management, or
Yes.
kind of protecting one area and then exposing another. So,
And then making the other more efficient, which
Yep.
in the long run might be a blessing.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. I think that about covers grip strength for the time being. I mean, I'm sure we'll bring it up again, but it's an important topic. I hope we brought some new ideas to the table with it, made it a little bit more practical for people, but also just, put a little different spin on it. Next week, what I think we kind of touched all the topics I wanted to touch on with longevity based movements. I think next week we'll go into some topics I've had some recommendations or suggestions for. So maybe we'll touch on nutrition a little bit. Dare we go there to that could be a hot topic, but I think it's a good one to maybe start going into some of these lifestyle factors, because I just think there's so many misconceptions out there.
Yeah.
And my intent would certainly not to be to tell anyone what to do, but just to have a different reframing of it and actually have people look at this more fundamentally or foundationally, as opposed to like there's a right way or a wrong way. So I think I'd like to broach that subject next week. So
All right,
hopefully the audience could be prepared for that.
get your popcorn ready.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will see you next week.
See you next week. Have a good weekend.
You too.